When it comes to Dre'Mont Jones, the deadline for the Denver Broncos is approaching. Will they franchise tag him? Will they extend him? Or will they let him walk? We take a look at each option on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country who tunes in and makes Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format, or whether you're watching on YouTube. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button if you have not done so already, so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more every single day, all year long. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Now, on today's show, we have a wide variety of topics we're going to get into regarding Dre'Mont Jones, Courtland Sutton trade rumors, and not to mention, should the NFL look at adopting some of the XFL's rules going forward? We make the case today, but Sayre, let's start things off with Dre'Mont Jones, because as of Tuesday, the timeline for the Broncos to either place the franchise tag on him before the March 7th deadline is kind of creeping close. Like, we're in that window right now. So during this time, they could either place the franchise tag on him, or they could extend him to a new contract, or by the time that March 7th deadline comes around, if they don't franchise tag him at all or negotiate a contract, they could let him walk in free agency.
And that's really not what we want to see. Is it? You definitely, I think out of all the options, right, you really want to be able to rule out, will the Broncos let him walk to free agency? I mean, their defensive line right now, Cody, is not exactly loaded. I think that you look at this unit on paper, you got some intriguing young guys. You got DJ Jones, obviously, Mike Purcell, one more year left on his deal, right? So I don't look at that unit and see something that's like, well, yeah, if Dre'Mont walks, you could just replace him. You don't have a first round pick. You don't have a second round pick. You would need to go to free agency and find somebody or somebody's multiple players to replace him. And that's going to cost you money. So I guess the only justification would be maybe you feel like you can go into free agency and get two guys on the defensive line that could play and maybe start for you, as opposed to spending that money on one guy, Dre'Mont Jones. But then again, he's a special player. And so I think that's why he's worthy of this discussion, right? The franchise tag coming in around $20 million, right? A little under 20 million. So it's around 18, 19 or so million. And that is a substantial amount of that entire amount counts against your salary cap. So it's not like you can spread it out over a couple of years. No, that would be a hefty count. I think that would make him the number 2 highest cap hit on the Broncos roster behind Russell Wilson's 22 million. So, I mean, it's a really tough thing to consider right there, isn't it? Dre'Mont, a very good player, but you'd rather get the long-term deal done, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, you're spot on there, right? Because as you said, you place the franchise tag on him, that's costing more than it is to extend him, right? And you get flexibility when you come to terms on a contract extension. Now, I think the perceived notion is like, what does Dre'Mont Jones' agent and him where do they sit on, this is my value, this is my number, we're not budging on it, right? We know negotiations are always part of the business. I think George Paton's one of the best in the business when we talk about NFL executives. Obviously, their survey that was conducted, the agents say, hey, this is the most trustworthy general manager that we negotiate with. So I think everything will be done in good faith. But as you mentioned, if they place the franchise tag, okay, so March 7th, right? That is the deadline, 2:00 p.m. Mountain Time. Denver has to decide, if they haven't done so already by the time March 7th comes around in this episode, they have to decide, are we going to franchise tag him? Because as you mentioned, if they franchise tag him and he's got the defensive end designation, he's going to cost $19.7 million next year. That is a lot for 1 year. And then there's no guarantee that even after next year that he stays and maybe he goes elsewhere. I mean, they could franchise tag him again. We know that Denver's done that in the past with several players. Justin Simmons was franchise tagged 2 years in a row, but then on that second year, actually got extended the contract that he deserves. We've seen it with Demaryius Thomas, Von Miller, guys in the past. The bigger question that I have here is, why not just extend him and just know, okay, this is a guy who's valuable to what we want to do, right? Because I put an article out on milehighsports.com. Dre'Mont Jones has so much value to this team, Sayre, and it's crazy to think that last year was his first year truly as a full-time starter, right? He started in 13 games. He missed the 4 games due to the hip injury at the end of the season. But, man, you talk about a guy who had a pretty dominant stretch in 13 games. I mean, he had a career-high 47 tackles. He had 6.5 sacks. He had 16 quarterback pressures, 10 quarterback hits. That right there is impressive, right? And everyone's like, oh, sacks. 6.5 for a guy who's playing his position is pretty good. You can maybe make the argument, if he played in those 4 games, does he get to 10? Does he get to double-digit sacks, right? But I also think that pressures speak volumes. People don't highlight pressures enough because pressures lead to more turnovers on the back end of the secondary. If forces quarterbacks to be a little bit desperate. Dre'Mont is very good at that. I believe the Broncos should do whatever they can in their power to keep Dre'Mont in Denver. I think you take him away, Denver, as you mentioned, it's an uphill climb in order for them to be able to have at least any kind of resemblance of his production. You might have to get his production out of 2 guys throughout the season, and that just simply isn't feasible for where the Broncos are at right now, in my opinion.
Right. And I think that a lot of fans may be thinking about, well, if you let Dre'Mont Jones walk in free agency, you could maybe go out and get some compensatory picks, right? Well, not so fast on that one either, because you let him walk in free agency. That's, that could in itself get you compensatory picks if you don't sign anybody yourself, right? So there's the whole that formula that involves, how compensatory picks are actually awarded to teams. It involves the players that you sign as well. So if you go out and, Dre'Mont Jones signs a deal for, let's say, $15 million a year, and then you go out and you sign an offensive tackle for $14 million a year, those 2 cancel out. So you're not getting a high compensatory pick for Dre'Mont Jones. And not to mention, there's a ton of really, really good free agents this year. So like the competitiveness to get a 3rd round compensatory pick in 2023, or I guess it would be 2024, is going to be very, very high. So don't worry about the compensatory picks when you're thinking about this. The Broncos probably won't get any for Dre'Mont Jones, quite frankly. And honestly, Cody, you see when the writing is on the wall here during free agency, right? If a player goes out during that legal negotiating period, a team could it seems like just instantly sign that player to a contract. It's like, how did Dre'Mont Jones so quickly agree to a 4-year, $60 million deal with the Carolina Panthers? The Broncos struggled to negotiate with him for a year and a half. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you see those kind of things happen, it's because the team didn't want the player bad enough to sign him to that amount, right? So you just got to understand these type of things. Like, it seems like it comes together so quickly for other teams, when the reality is that the team that's letting this free agent go doesn't want them bad enough to sign them to what they're asking for. And that's just the cold hard truth. So with Dre'Mont Jones, man, you hope that they can settle somewhere in that $16 million per year range. $20 million a year, I might let him walk, Cody. Quite honestly, I think that's a hard price to pay for any position, much less defensive line. I might let him walk at $20 million a year if that's his line in the sand. But $15 million a year, 16. I mean, I know it doesn't seem like that much, but that's a starting player difference right there. So that is where I would land on Dre'Mont Jones, and I hope the Broncos are able to get something done with him, give him a nice little guarantee or something, like big signing bonus, something like that.
Oh, we'll have to see how everything plays out. But Broncos country, important dates to note. March 7th is the deadline to franchise tag players. And then after that, March 15th, it is the new league year, 2:00 p.m. Mountain Time. Both days is when those processes take out on March 7th, respectively, and March 15th. And one thing is for certain, we'll have you covered every step of the way. Free agency frenzy here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. We're eager for your thoughts. So Broncos country, if you're watching on YouTube, comment down below your thoughts on Dre'Mont Jones and his situation. If you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, you can always tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But Broncos country, one of the things we've heard through the grapevine is that there are a lot of rumors going around Courtland Sutton and him being a potential trade option for the Broncos this offseason. Should the Broncos look into it, or should they not? We'll dive into that on today's episode of the show This episode is brought to you by our friends FanDuel Sportsbook. The midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, it's secure, and it's super easy to use. And then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers to threes drained to triple-double in a game if you want to go that far. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay, so don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Will the Denver Broncos look into trading Courtland Sutton this offseason as rumors begin to heat up ahead of NFL free agency, the NFL draft, the NFL scouting combine is coming up? Usually these are where a lot of these conversations take place, Sayre. And for the Broncos, they have some interesting names that have been floated out in some potential trade rumors. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day, you can get us on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or you can get us on YouTube, where you can watch us every single day, and you can interact with other members in Broncos country. With that said, Courtland Sutton's name has been brought up recently in some trade rumors, Sayre, and I think that we've had conversations throughout the offseason, even during the season, about some elements where Courtland obviously can be better. We all know now that the Broncos will have an entirely new wide receiver coach, so this could change things drastically for the Broncos with Zach Azzanni going to the New York Jets and reuniting with Nathaniel Hackett. Don't choke on your coffee there, my friend. Outside of that, What are your thoughts on some of these rumblings about Courtland Sutton? I think we have some angles we can approach this from, and I'm excited to break it down with you and everybody in Broncos country.
Yeah, well, first off, shout out to Zach Azzanni. I mean, he was with the Broncos since 2018, right? I mean, he was there from the beginning of Courtland Sutton's career, as we're talking about Sutton, the former second-round pick. Saw him become a Pro Bowler in 2019, right? So Zach Azzanni has been a very interesting subject in Broncos country, hasn't he, Cody? But I mean, to give the guy his flowers, man, he did develop some young. He was tasked with overseeing that unit as they were transitioning away from the late great Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders in consecutive years. So kudos to him for developing those guys and working with those players and really building an exciting unit. So, but with Courtland Sutton, you know, it's kind of a trendy topic right now, because I think you look at the Broncos roster and you're like, okay, where could they potentially recoup some 2023 NFL draft capital, right? And you look at that wide receiver group and you see Sutton, Judy, Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler. You hear all the rumors about Michael Thomas and Brandon Cooks and all these sort of things. And you're like, well, somebody's got to go, right? Somebody's not going to be there. And I think there may be some truth to that. There may be some validity to that. But the rumor that we saw, you know, on Twitter going around the last couple days, one specific idea actually came from our good friend Benjamin Albright, who said, you know, one of those who says no type of situations, right? The Broncos send Courtland Sutton and a 4th-round pick to the New York Jets for Zach Wilson and Denzel Mims. And the thought behind that is that you get a young quarterback to put behind Russell Wilson to let your coaching staff under Sean Payton develop him, at the cost, though, of Courtland Sutton. And I think that is right there, to me, the big maybe red alert. You know, you turn on the sirens, you're like, can't do that.
What would you say? Would you say, like, in a scenario where someone says no, I think the Broncos say no, I'm saying no. Are you saying no?
Yeah. I would say no, absolutely. Good. I think, you know, the idea of Zach Wilson, we could talk about that in terms of like, hey, if the Jets are dumping him for a late pick and Sean Payton's like, hey, you know what? Maybe I could work with this guy. Sure, go ahead. Late round pick. I don't care. But for Courtland Sutton, that's a starter. That's an impact starter. So, yeah, right. The next Taysom Hill. Throw Zach Wilson out there. Hey, we know he's good at avoiding tacklers. We saw that when the Broncos played the Jets this past year. Oh, Cody, that's where I kind of start to think like, okay, is that really where Courtland Sutton's trade value is?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to ask, right? Because I would even say in 2022, like last season, Courtland got off to kind of a pretty big start, right? We were looking at him and his production, like, okay, hey, Courtland is wide receiver 1 because he's seeing a workload. I mean, he had 12 catches against the Texans. Like, he put the Broncos on his back there, right? But then he also dealt with some injuries throughout the season, And Denver just went on this losing streak where the offense just nosedived. And you could definitely tell Courtland was frustrated with how certain things were going last year. And like I said, I had a chance to chat with him a little bit, at the end of the season, and after the final game against the Chargers in the locker room, and just kind of see where he's at and what he's got going on for the offseason. And, it seemed like this year was just an off year for everybody in a sense, right? And I think when we started to see the Broncos offense start to move Jerry Jeudy around, I think it opened up more opportunities for Courtland Sutton to make plays, right? Like in that Chargers game, he didn't have like 8 or 9 catches, but he had a couple of catches and a big one for a touchdown in that game, right? So I don't think that wide receiver room is predicated off, I have to have these massive stats. As long as they're eating and the Broncos offense moving the ball, I'm telling you, every player in that locker room, Sayre, they want the offense to be better. They will take having 3 catches for 50 yards if it means that they win a game and that the offense is putting up points. I can tell you that with 100% certainty. So for me, you have to ask yourself, is it valuable at this point in time trading away a guy who's your biggest wide receiver, big catch radius, and maybe banking on the fact, okay, Tim Patrick's coming back from an ACL, right? But as you and I have always said on the show, and we even said it when Courtland was coming off his ACL, temper your expectations because it's still going to be a filling out process coming back from an injury like that. So for a guy like Tim Patrick, I'm not placing all these massive expectations on him. I want him to slowly come along, right? And if he just magically comes out and just bam, like, hey, I'm back like I never left, great. Best case scenario, that's what happens. But the reality of it is that's more than likely not going to be the case for so many guys. Are you confident enough with your wide receiver depth that you're comfortable trading away a guy like Courtland Sutton just to get draft capital, which could turn into a guy that may or may not even work out for you?
No, Cody, I don't want to trade any of these guys. No. Like you said, you made a great point.
We have yet to see them all together.
Yeah, we have yet. We haven't. It's so sad. Like the same was true of, remember, Bradley Chubb and Von Miller. Like we barely ever got to see those guys together. I would rather try for that best case scenario, like you mentioned, where all these guys are healthy and where all these guys are able to play, and where it's like, okay, like how are we going to figure out how to divvy up the snaps and the targets? And we got too many guys healthy. Man, that's a problem that I would love to have with the Denver Broncos this year, as opposed to, what we've been seeing, which is, okay, well, we need Brandon Johnson and Jalen Virgil and Kendall Hinton to really step up this week. Maybe Montreal Washington has a big game. Like that was the situation with the wide receivers at the end of last season or in the middle of last season. So I would much rather not do something like this, especially because you look at Courtland Sutton and it's like, okay, the cap savings, are they really there? Are you going to get a first or second round pick for him? No and no. So because of those two things, and because of the third thing, which is you can't stay healthy at receiver, and at least Sutton has played the majority of games the last 2 years, man, I would be so against that. And I get the idea that people, you want to throw some names out there and say, hey, well, maybe if a team does come calling at this price, or maybe if the Broncos really do love Michael Thomas this much, I guess I don't know what's ultimately going to happen. But without knowing like the here's the replacement coming in, before we know that, I'm kind of opposed to this idea of trading Courtland Sutton. Just I'd rather get a healthy version of everybody and see what they can do. And that's the other thing to consider. How much better could he be in the Sean Payton offense, right? That's something that I thought about as, we throw out KJ Hamler's name as a trade candidate potentially. And it's like, well, maybe you'd rather see what he could do in 1 year with Sean Payton as opposed to just sending him away for a 5th or 6th round draft pick. I mean, those are the alternatives that we now have to consider. Is it worth a mid third round pick, late third round pick, as opposed to having Courtland Sutton on your roster? I mean, I would much rather have Sutton around.
Well, and I think another thing you can look at, let's say everyone's healthy, they're balling out. Maybe at that point at the trade deadline, Denver receives calls and considers it. Maybe you have a chance to boost value at that point. So I think that's something to consider. Broncos country, we're eager for your thoughts on Courtland Sutton. Some of the trade rumors that have come out recently surrounding him. What are your thoughts on it? Make sure you drop it in the YouTube comments down below. If you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But on today's episode of the show, the XFL is innovative in many ways, including the rules from a former Broncos executive. Could the NFL look at maybe adopting some of these rules, you'll get that on today's episode of the show. But before we get into all that, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who takes time to listen to Locked On Broncos every single day. If you are a Colorado sports fan, we have everything you need here at the Locked On Podcast Network. You're a Nuggets fan. We have Locked On Nuggets with Adam Mares and Matt Moore. You have the Locked On Avalanche podcast with Chris Maselli and Kyle Sullivan. You also have the Locked On Rockies podcast with Paul Holden. And we now have the Locked On Buffs podcast. If you're excited about primetime Deion Sanders, make sure you check out the Locked On Buffs podcast. You can get these free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format. The Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As we jump into the fourth quarter on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, the XFL had some very innovative rule changes that made the games overall better in their debut this past weekend. Could the NFL look to adopt them, including a former rule introduced by former Broncos GM John Elway? Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you're watching on YouTube. Sayre, I don't know about you. I enjoyed this weekend sitting back and watching the XFL kind of restart again under Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Danny Garcia. And I tell you what, I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. Not to mention there's a multitude of former Broncos like Cody Latimer, Paxton Lynch, Lyndon Stevens. There's just a multitude of guys, Elijah Holder. It was cool to watch some of these guys that I've seen at training camp. But for me, man, some of the rules that they have, I think would make the NFL product even more exciting. We all know NFL is king. The ratings, they're at the top. Could you imagine in situations if they adopted some of these rules? Now, for example, I think we should start off with John Elway. He proposed, instead of an onside kick, as we all know in the NFL, unlikely to succeed unless you're Younghoe Koo. Younghoe Koo's very good at onside kicks. But outside of that, what if you got the chance to opt to have a 4th and 15, right? Instead of going for the onside kick. And then if you convert, the drive extends and you still maintain possession of the ball. You don't get it, the other team takes over possession, and then essentially the game's over. This is a fourth quarter rule only, but it got used this past weekend for the St. Louis Battlehawks, who scored 15 points in like 2 minutes. And part of it was they converted a 4th and 15 to extend the drive to eventually go down and win the game. I was excited about that.
It's pretty cool to kind of see it in action, right? And I think that when you think about a rule like this, then you think about, okay, let's look at this from the Broncos perspective for a second here. The Broncos, for whatever reason, the stroke of the football gods shining down upon them, they have a 6-point lead against the Kansas City Chiefs late in the season, and you're finally about to beat the Kansas City Chiefs, get that victory. And then, Kansas City all of a sudden has an opportunity to kick an onside. They kick a field goal to go down by 6, and they're like, hey, we're going to go for 4th and 15. And it's like Patrick Mahomes has the ball in his hands, 4th and 15, and you're up by 6 points as a defense. And it's like, I wish we had the old onside kick rules at this point. I think that doesn't take away from how fun it is to see that rule in practice. But at the same time, it kind of makes you wonder, like, if you're on the receiving end of, hey, Mahomes has an opportunity here, 4th and 15, instead of an onside kick, does that give you any more trepidation about that rule? Although I do think that rule makes it more fun on a week-to-week basis for everyone. Like, any game that I would be watching that doesn't involve the Broncos up by 6 late in the fourth quarter, right, or up by 7 or up by 3 or whatever the case may be late in the fourth, I think that makes it way more fun. And I think that's exactly the goal of it, entertainment, right? So where do you kind of fall as in terms of kind of applying it to that situation for the Denver Broncos specifically?
I like it because, as we've seen, the Broncos in a majority of their games this year have trailed, right? So if they ever made things like intriguing enough, I'd be excited to see a 4th and 15. I think the chances of getting that are a lot better than, Brandon McManus onside kick. I mean, the success rate of onside kicks in the NFL has dropped drastically to the point. It's like, all right, you almost kind of know, unless there's like some drastic error by the onside, like the hands team, the return team, I mean, you're going to still lose the game. You're not going to get the onside kick. However, I think the intrigue, right? Let's say there's a minute 50 left and okay, yeah, you kick the field goal, you're down 3, but you want to go instead of the onside kick, you want the 4th and 15, you're going to try it. You convert it. Guess what? Bang. You have an opportunity to drive downfield, kick a field goal to tie the game up potentially. So for me, I like it. I think it adds more intrigue in fourth quarters. And the cool thing about this rule, You can't do this in the third quarter, the second quarter, the first quarter. You can only do this in the fourth quarter. So you know what that's going to mean? Like everyone's going to get the alert on their phones. Team down by 3 points, going for a 4th and 15. Tune in now. Like it's going to increase ratings at the end of games, right? Which ultimately I think makes the league more money. It's smart to look at something like this. I think the XFL has done some really intriguing things. There's going to be more games on Thursday on FX. So for those that haven't watched any of the XFL, highly, highly encourage you to do it this week here for week 2. Now, another one has to do with kickoffs, right? We talk so much about safety. Kickoff is a very violent element to the National Football League because you're running down, from your own 35-yard line. You're going all the way down and you're smacking into other people at high speed. To me, I like how the XFL does it because the teams, the kickoff team, the return team, they begin play within 5 yards apart from one another, Sayre, and they kick at the kicking team is obviously at the opponent's 35-yard line. The return team's at their own 30-yard line. So once they kick it, they cannot engage, right? Once the ball hits the hands of the returner, then both sides engage. They're only 5 yards apart at this point. To me, I think it engages the creativity of, okay, hey, we have to win our one-on-one block. How many times are you going to see a better return out of it? I mean, there's opportunities with some of the league's most explosive players, but you have a chance to start off with great field position. Denver last year, they had the worst starting field position of any team in the NFL. It was under 20 yards, which is not ideal. So I like that. And then I also like the fact that there are no extra points in the XFL. I mean, after you score a touchdown, you can do a 1-point conversion, which is like a single down from the 2-yard line. You can do a 2-point conversion, which is a single down from the 5-yard line. You can even do a 3-point conversion, which is a single down from the 10-yard line. I look at how offenses play now, and I look at like defenses like Joe Burrow. You look at Josh Allen. You look at maybe some of the best red zone defenses like Denver's last year. Could you imagine like getting a stop there if you're a defensive side, on the defensive side? And then could you imagine scoring and getting like a 3-point advantage? It just forces you to be more creative. I think it's more exciting and more exhilarating. What are your final thoughts on that?
That would give us some wacky final scores that we've like never seen in the NFL, right? With a 3-point conversion being possible. And I mean, I honestly love those ideas. I think the best thing that I saw is that kickoff idea too. I mean, it's as far as from like a safety perspective for these players and as far as like taking a play that has become so pointless in the NFL today and making it, that this now has a point. Like this is now a role created for other players, like to highlight special teams guys who are really good in these situations. So kickoff returners benefits them. Guys who are really good at finding, that hole and attacking the kickoff returner and making that big special teams tackle, it benefits them. Those guys get devalued in today's NFL unless you're really good in punt return or punt coverage as well, because you now don't get the opportunity to go make that game-changing play, that game-changing hit. And so I think that, yes, that is a rule that I think the NFL should look at and be like, okay, we need to do that. 3-point conversions, I don't know if the NFL is going to allow that. You know how much Andy Reid is going to be lining up at the 10-yard line being like, hey, we're going for 3. He's holding up 3 on the sideline. I could see that happening quite a bit. And I would be here for it. I don't know if the NFL is going to, be on board for that as much as they like to have every team in it every week. But certainly the XFL has done some things in terms of making it more exciting, making it more interesting to see. I want to see some team go for 3 after they score a touchdown, right? I want to see a coach be aggressive and go for that. And I want to see these teams try new things. I want to see, football evolve to the next level, not to get to a ridiculous point, but to get to a point where it's like, hey, that actually makes a lot of sense. Like kicking an extra point is lame anymore. Like moving it back 15 yards, who cares? I love the innovation. I love that they're trying things and being creative.
Well, and they're also, they do have a little bit of an extended partnership with the NFL. I know it's going to benefit some officiating. They have this instant replay, I think, protocol, which is really cool. The NFL would absolutely benefit from, though it stopped the game for a tiny bit. Who cares? We want to see. We want to hear the discussion, the dialogue. It's like what they're looking at, whether they're going to overturn something. There's too many questions about officiating. I think you can clear some things up. The XFL is finding a way to be innovative, and I hope the NFL looks to adopt some of their principles going forward. Broncos country, let us know down below what you think about some of the XFL's rules. Interact with other members in Broncos country. If you're watching on YouTube, you can always tweet us on Twitter. If you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platforms, you can tweet us at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But one thing is for certain, we'll have you covered every step of the way as the Broncos look to name their offensive coordinator and their defensive coordinator hopefully before the NFL Scout and Combine begins. Sayre and I will have you covered every step of the way here on Locked On Broncos. We'll see you tomorrow for a brand new episode of the show.